from here right across the plaza. So it's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. I have good news and bad news. Which do you want first? It's good to be back in New York. I do a lot of traveling. I'm in the Midwest, and they're like, "Of course we want the good news."
Hey.
It's good to be back.
We're a cheerful people.
I kid the Midwest because I love them.
We can't help our voting rights.
I spent a few months in Kansas where I met Lori in 1992. Well, the bad news is 42 million Americans live in homes that can't afford enough food. Now, sometimes people want to marginalize that number and make it seem like it's some small little subsection of the population. That equals the population of California and New Hampshire combined. It's a huge, huge population. 13 million American children. 13 million American children, that's about the population of New York City and LA combined, a little more of them, live in homes that can't afford enough food. Here in New York City, the richest city in the history of the world, 1.4 million of our neighbors, including 500,000 children, live in homes that can't afford enough food. Now, are they starving to death like you might see in Somalia or parts of sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia or Haiti, and our thoughts and prayers are with Haiti tonight after the hurricane? No, they're not starving to death. Because we have a resemblance, still remnants, of a federal nutrition assistance safety net. We have some wage protections for workers. And so things are not quite as bad as the worst off countries on the planet. But I point out we don't compare our Olympic teams to Somalia. We don't compare our space program to Bangladesh. And we really should be looking at the countries with economies more similar to ours, and we're doing worse than every one of them, even per capita. We're the only industrialized Western nation on the planet with anything close to this level of poverty and hunger. And even the level of poverty and hunger that we do have has devastating impacts. No, it's not people starving in the streets generally. It's people choosing between food and medicine. It's parents going without food so their kids have food. A school official once told me in the Bronx they saw a kid going through a dumpster to get breakfast. A rabbi once told me they had someone sidle up to them at a Starbucks, and after they left Starbucks, the rabbi left the Starbucks, they ate crumbs off their plate. And the greatest irony of all, because healthier food is more expensive, it's harder to find in low-income neighborhoods, it takes more time to prepare, and for all this talk that low-income people are lazy takers, they're working 2 or 3 jobs, they don't have time to cook everything from scratch after having grown it in their own community garden. Healthier food is harder to get, more expensive, and the greatest irony of the world is that hunger and obesity are flip sides of the same malnutrition coin. And the hungriest neighborhoods are also the most obese neighborhoods here in New York and everywhere in the country. Hungry children do not learn. To be schooled, you must be fueled. To be well-read, you must be well-fed. That's my Dr. Seuss moment, or Jesse Jackson moment, however you want to define my poetry for the night. Hungry workers can't work and be productive. Hungry seniors can't stay independent. And because of this, hunger costs our society $167.5 billion a year. That's billion with a B. A senator once said, $1 billion here, $1 billion there. Pretty soon you're talking about real money. And so this is devastating. And every major issue we want to solve as a society, we cannot solve unless we fix this problem first. Fixing public education? No way. Really reforming the criminal justice system? As long as people are committing petty crimes because having a roof over the head and 3 meals is better than what they're having, there's no way we're going to reform criminal justice unless we do something about this. Defending ourselves against threats from the world? The school lunch program was started in the 1940s as a defense program because generals came to President Truman and said, our boys are too hungry to fight. I point out no country in the history of the world that has started as a superpower has remained a superpower if it's failed to adequately feed its own populace. Reducing healthcare spending, there's no way we're going to do that unless we make sure all Americans have access to affordable, convenient, nutritious food. So every major problem we want to solve as a society, just as a practical matter, for our economic self-interest, has to go through ending hunger. That's number one. Number two, we know that every religious and ethical tradition on the planet makes this a centerpiece. Those of you who know a bit about the Old Testament, the commandments that you must give some food from the side of your field, glean a certain percentage, I'll point out that it is a commandment. It's not charity. Jewish tradition, the root of tzedakah is often poorly translated into charity when it really means justice. But it's a commandment, and it doesn't say you pick and choose who you give to if you feel generous one day. It says you must give it to this and this and this, including strangers, who I would argue today would be translated into immigrants. The New Testament, some of you may be familiar with that, Matthew 25, this incredible passage where Christ says, when you feed the hungry and house the homeless, it's as if you fed me, and if you believe he's the Son of the Lord, it means that feeding the most down and out, or as he calls the least of these, is the same as feeding the Lord. And by the way, if you don't, you're going to be damned. And every other religious tradition, from Hinduism to Islam to Buddhism, has a serious social justice component that focuses on all these issues. So whether you care about it from an ethical standpoint, or you don't give a squat about ethics, although if you're in Amy and Justin's house, that couldn't possibly be the case. But if you just care what's in it for me, understand that we've got to do something about this. And again, this idea that it's these other people, it's never us. Half of everyone in America is at some point going to be on the SNAP program, the food stamps program. Half of all the people in America. And one other statistic about poverty, because we have this stereotype that, it's all about this permanent underclass. Between 2008 and 2012, that's 4 years. I'm not a math genius, but that's 48 months, right? You're in business, right?
Yeah.
Four times 12, 48. Guess what percentage of Americans were below the poverty line for at least 1 month during that 48-month period? About a third. About a third of all Americans were in poverty once over these 4 years. You know what percentage of Americans were poor the entire 48 months? Less than 3%. Less than 3%. So now 3% of a country with over 300 million people, still over 10 million people, but the vast majority of the tens of millions of people who are hungry, are poor, aren't a permanent underclass. They aren't people who are never employed. They aren't people who have just had a zillion babies the way the right with these racist undertones would have you believe. The truth of the matter is they're working 1 or 2 or 3 jobs, and they just don't earn enough to feed their families. So that's the bad news. You're ready for the good news now. I can see it on your faces. The good news is history proves we can entirely solve this problem. History proves we can entirely solve this problem if we are smart and we do it right. And we apply not just our hearts, but our heads to this problem. And that's something else I get from the Jewish tradition of the practicality of charity, from Maimonides to other philosophers and scholars. It's not just good enough to feel good about something, you actually have to make an impact. I have other good news, that things, even for the hungriest kids in New York today, are far better than they were in 1910. How do we know that? Because you guys ever heard of Frances Perkins? Mm-hmm. Sophisticated room. You guys know who she is. That's great. She was the first female cabinet secretary in U.S. history. Right? She was the first New York State female cabinet secretary in New York State history. She was then Governor Al Smith, Secretary of Labor. Then when Franklin Roosevelt became governor of New York, he kept her on. And then when he became president, made her the first female U.S. cabinet secretary. My great aunt survived the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, if you know what that is. This great tragic event in labor history, and she was key in investigating the aftermath of that. She helped write the Social Security Act. She brought over that idea from Germany, from Bismarck. She helped create the first worker safety laws, the first minimum wage laws in America. Very significant woman. What's that? Child labor laws. And I joke, she's and the Department of Labor building in D.C. is named after her. as opposed to the building I worked for in 8 years in the Clinton administration, named after Jamie Whitten, an ardent segregationist. So I joke, she's one of the few people with a building named after her in Washington that really deserves it. But in 1910, as a young graduate student at Columbia, she wrote about hunger in New York City in the Hell's Kitchen neighborhood, when it was really Hell's Kitchen, before the realtors renamed it Clinton. And kids there, they were, then in the North, poverty was white. And it was Irish American and Italian American immigrants. I'm not being ethnically stereotypical. This is what her records show. The Italian kids were eating a little polenta. Irish kids were eating a little potatoes and basically thin gruel and soup. Rarely fresh vegetables, rarely any vegetables at all, rarely any fruit at all. If they got any milk, it was sometimes adulterated and they died from poisoned milk. And the kids were starving to death the way you might see in parts of Somalia today. It was far worse then than it is today. Why? Because in 1910, there was no SNAP food stamps program. There's no school lunch program, no school breakfast program, no summer meals program, no WIC program, Women's, Infants, and Children program. There are a few soup kitchens that serve the down and out on the Lower East Side when it was still the Bowery and Skid Row before it was Hipster Central. But you really didn't have these food pantries in America, and certainly not food banks, and certainly no system of providing government aid to these agencies. The worst off kids today are generally far better than they were in 1910. And these programs make a difference. Then we had the Depression, things were horrible. The school lunch program in the 1940s significantly reduced child hunger in America, but by the late 1970s, we still had pockets of third world style starvation in America. Probably not too far from here in places in central Brooklyn like Bed-Stuy or Harlem, but white areas of Appalachia, Latino areas of the Texas-Mexico border, and Native American reservations, places like the South Side of Chicago. How do we know? Because teams of doctors went to these places and documented pockets of third world style starvation. What happened? Two things. The media focused on this issue, and in 1967, 1968, there were a few dozen network news stories on hunger in America. And those were pushed by advocacy groups who helped commission the study and get the study media coverage. CBS ran a 50-minute primetime special on hunger in America. And unlike the specials today that might give the impression some food drives are going to solve the problem, it made it clear that the reason we had this problem, government was failing. That's number one. Number two, and the activists organized. Before I researched my first book, and I'll talk about my second book in 1 second, is that I sort of believe the common myth that Martin Luther King started the Poor People's Movement. He didn't really get much progress because people were far less interested in doing something about poverty than civil rights. He was assassinated and it was gone and the movement died. That's not quite true. He was assassinated in the middle of the Poor People's Movement, but the movement carried on, and one of their top demands was the creation of the modern nutrition assistance safety net. So Richard Nixon, running for president in 1960, denies that hunger is a problem at all in America. Within a year, he holds the first and only White House conference on hunger. That wasn't window dressing. It laid the predicate for creating the modern food stamps program. He signed by executive order the Women's, Infants, and Children program, and created a bipartisan consensus to do something serious about this. How did we go in 1 year from Richard Nixon denying this as a problem to doing arguably more about this issue than any president since? And it wasn't because Richard Nixon magically became a good guy. Spoiler alert, he wasn't. It's because the political pressure and the media pressure forced him to do it. And what happened after that is the modern safety net was ramped up. The modern food stamps program was created, the Women's, Infants, and Children program was created, school lunches were matched by school breakfast, summer meals were rolled out. And within a decade, we almost entirely ended hunger in America. Let me say this again. By the late 1970s, we almost entirely ended hunger in America. Most of it was the safety net, but was also that we had a more inclusive economy, that if you were working full-time, you were earning enough, by and large, to have a middle-class lifestyle. So how did we go from almost ending hunger in America to having 42 million of our neighbors living in homes that can't afford enough food? Well, quick secular parable. Let's say we used to fight fires with buckets, 1 bucket at a time, 1 bucket at a time, 1 bucket at a time. If you've read David McCulloch's book, 1776, about New York City in 1776, and if you haven't, I highly recommend it because part of it happens a few feet from here. There's vivid descriptions of the Battle of Brooklyn, or then known as the Battle of Long Island in the Revolutionary War, which literally feet from here in Prospect Park took place, or Boerum Hill now. But it also talks about the Great Fire of 1776 that demolished New York City. We don't know whether George Washington's troops purposely burned down New York so the British couldn't get the prize that was New York, or it was an accident, but New York City was gone. Right? We don't know whether the Great Chicago's Fire was really started by Mrs. O'Leary's cow knocking over a lantern, but we know Chicago was ashes within days. Seattle and San Francisco had big earthquakes, but it wasn't the fires. It wasn't the earthquakes that killed the cities, it was the fires that followed. And the problem was the bucket brigades made us feel great, but they weren't putting out the fires. And so how did we stop cities from burning down? We replaced modern bucket brigades, antiquated bucket brigades. And by the way, one night when I was researching my book, I woke up at 3 a.m. At least I have one witness here for this, to determine, I wonder how much water a bucket brigade could deliver in a minute. I'm sure many of you, the same things happened to you. And I calculate, if you're lucky, they don't run out of water, it doesn't freeze, it doesn't evaporate, 60 gallons of water a minute. And then I used modern research to determine, through this very sophisticated system called Google, that a modern fire truck delivers 1,000 gallons of water a minute, at least at the time 8 years ago. I recently met the head of the Firefighters Union in New York and told him this. He said, oh, it's up to 2,000 gallons of water a minute. So we replaced the bucket brigades with modern fire trucks. We replaced volunteers who didn't always show up at 3 a.m. in February with professional fire departments. And I don't know what New York City firemen are doing when they're not fighting fires. I think if you believe the hype, they're all posing for calendars and like cooking their grandmother's lasagna recipe or something. But we know as New Yorkers, we're damn grateful that when we're running the hell out, they're running in. And whether it's 3 a.m. in February, they're on call because our tax dollars have paid for them to be on call. And we have modern fire prevention things. I'm sure this fine building would have been built with sprinklers anyway, but the old Triangle Shirtwaist Fire building wouldn't have built. And now you can't build buildings out of paper mache doused in kerosene or whatever they used to build buildings out of. You have fire retardant materials enforced by government building inspectors. Now the reason I tell you this parable is, and I've asked this question, I'll ask this question here, and I've asked it in places like Alabama and Alaska, some pretty conservative places. If your house is burning down, and you're there with all your prized possessions, your family photos, your cat, the copy of my first book that you're going to run right out and get after this, all your prized possessions, your pre-order form for my new book, all your prized possessions, which would you prefer? A volunteer bucket brigade, which may or may not show up. If they do show up, they're going to have 60 gallons of water a minute if they don't run out. Can't reach the third floor you're at, or would you prefer a professional fire department with 1,000 or 2,000 gallons of water a minute that's guaranteed to show up in minutes because your tax dollars are paid for them to be on call? Any of you prefer the bucket brigades?
No.
No, not once. And I'm talking, Alabama, Utah, really conservative places I pose this question. Not once, and even the most Tea Party fueled state, even the most anti-government state, has anyone ever said, when it comes to my own family's health and safety, would I prefer uncoordinated, unfunded volunteers with antiquated technology? So here's my obvious punchline. Then why in the world do we say that's good enough for fighting hunger? Instead of one bucket at a time, one bucket at a time, one bucket at a time, we've adopted the bucket brigades of food drives, one can at a time, one can at a time, one can at a time. It makes us feel great. Look, the bucket brigades made us feel great, but it's not working. Every year, we're doing more and more food drives, and every year this problem is pervasive, affecting tens of millions of people. We know from history that only one thing really changes things: a people's movement that prompts government to do the right thing. A people's movement that prompts government to do the right thing. If you've seen Selma, great movie, except for its sort of false smearing of LBJ. He deserved to be smeared on Vietnam, not on civil rights, where it was truly great. But debate, whether it was the people's movement or a government. I think that this is the point. You couldn't have one without the other. That there's no way LBJ could have gotten it done without King and millions of Americans risking their lives for it. And there's no way that they could have had this progress without the federal government stepping in with all the power of the federal government. And that's what solved major problems in America. And that's what it's going to take to finally wipe out hunger in America. And that's why a few years ago, Hunger Free America changed our name from the New York City Coalition Against Hunger as we expanded what we are doing to really try to build the political movement around this country to finally end this problem. I was saying my new book is called America We Need to Talk, a self-help book for the country. So it is a parody of self-help books, right? But it's about politics. That's the given. So the first chapter is like the talk, America, I love you, but I'm not in love with you anymore. Another's why buy the politician when you can get the milk for free. Another's chicken soup for the soul brother and soul sister. Another's the rules for capturing Mr. Right Wing. Republicans are from Mars, Democrats are from Venus, that kind of thing. You get the idea. But it has two serious underlying points. Number one is, as I explained, it's a mistake to say that hunger and poverty are detached from the rest of America's problems and detached from the decline in the middle class. They're one and the same. Number one. And number two, there is a relationship that needs to be fixed, and that's of the American people to our government and the American people for society. And I wrote this, frankly, started writing this before I knew who was going to be the nominee of one of the two major parties there. And basically, it's a cop-out to blame the politicians. It's a cop-out to blame the system. That's all of our responsibility as citizens to fix this. And I point out, well, people say, oh, well, Joel, the political system is so broken, you can't ever change anything. I say, first of all, that's just factually untrue. I suspect, Hunger Free America doesn't have a formal position on marriage equity. I personally, as a human being, happen to be, for marriage equity and against discrimination at any point of view. And if you said 20 years ago, oh, by the way, by 2016, people are going to be able to marry people of, whoever they love, and not just in New York and Massachusetts and California, but in Utah and Alabama and Mississippi and in every state of the United States, you'd say, no way. And when marriage equity people started, they would say, you're crazy. No way it's going to happen. But they built a movement. And one of the things we're doing in Hunger Free America is putting low-income people in the front of this movement, because no social movement in the history of the world has been won by one people on behalf of another. If you women were just waiting for men to give you the right to vote, you'd still be hanging out with Susan B. Anthony, chained to some polling booth. There wouldn't have happened. You demanded that it would happen. If gay people were just waiting for straight people to wake up, oh, sure, you can get married, wouldn't have happened. Same with every social movement in history. It's great that there are allies. It's certainly helpful that people who are non-black fought for the civil rights movement, and some gave the ultimate price, their life. But there's no question, if it wasn't a black-led movement, we wouldn't have had the progress we had. We still obviously have a lot of progress to go. So we're one of the few groups in the country that's really organizing low-income people on the hunger front to be the voice, and not just say we're going to be their voice. That's very patronizing. Helping them use their voice to explain to elected officials, to explain to the media why this problem needs to change. So the marriage equity movement was highly successful. The Fight for 15 movement to raise the minimum wage was extraordinarily successful, at least in New York and some other places. When it started a few years ago, I actually and many union organizers thought they were crazy. 15, we were at 725 in New York. We thought, no way this is going to happen. All us sophisticates. But it was the people most affected say, I can't wait to feed my family. I'm working full time. This has got to happen. And they struck when they didn't have a, what in, and they forced the discussion. And so that's what we're trying to do on the hunger world, combining the sophisticated political strategies with the grassroots know-how. So we do a lot of other things at the organization. We have a pioneering Ending Hunger Through Citizen Service initiative. We're trying to redefine the way people volunteer, saying showing up on Christmas and Thanksgiving to move some cans is fine, but if you have professional skills, we much more need that. If you're an accountant, we need accounting help. If you're a writer, we need people to write and edit our publications and grants. If you're a computer person, we need help with that. If you're a business person, we need strategic planning. And the truth is that and advocacy work, 5 hours of that kind of work will do more than 5 years of shelving hands to really end hunger in America. So we have an initiative to do that. We do a lot of work to help people access food stamps, SNAP benefits. We do a lot of work to pressure and cajole and work with cities to increase school breakfast participation. We had a huge victory in New York City where we finally got the government of the city of New York, when de Blasio became mayor, to say that every school in New York City, every elementary school, is going to serve breakfast in the first period classroom, because we were last in the country in breakfast participation. So as a result of this, a few 100,000 kids per day are going to get breakfast that weren't having breakfast. That's 180 days out of the school year. And that's why I say it's the safety net and wages that make the biggest difference. Just raising wages by $1 an hour nationwide will provide billions of dollars of food purchasing power to low-income people, and that's what it's going to take to end this problem. So if you say, well, organizing doesn't work, A, it does, or B, Joel, how can we solve this problem without this political movement? I say that's like asking me, how can you solve drought without water? You cannot. If you say, well, it's too hard. It's just too, I get this is, but it's just too hard. I respectfully say, some of our grandparents coming over in steerage, knowing whether they're going to die of diphtheria or whatever on the ride over and not knowing what they were going to face when they stepped off the boat. That was hard. Crossing 10,000 years ago, the first Native Americans crossing over the Bering Land Bridge, that was hard. Landing at Normandy Beach when there was, machine gun and mortar fire, that was hard. Having the crap clubbed out of you, and having your head smacked around by billy clubs at Selma because you thought, people should have the right to vote no matter the skin color. That was hard. And let me tell you, a parent with 3 kids having to tell them that they don't know where they're going to get food that night, that's hard. Doing this, calling our elected officials, donating to groups like Hunger Free America, getting your friends involved, volunteering in the most effective way possible. It's relatively easy, and part of our job is to make it easier to build this movement necessary to get the job done. We are told that things are inevitable, but history proves things we used to think were inevitable are now unthinkable. We were told slavery was inevitable. Oh, half the country has it. Supreme Court, the ultimate arbiter of freedom, said that Dred Scott's not a human being, he's a piece of property. We can't do anything about it. Now it's unthinkable. Child labor is an even more modern example. We were told nothing you can do about it. Supreme Court ruled not once but twice that Congress had no power to ban child labor, but a people's movement rose up and said, we don't have to accept child labor in America. We end it in America. Today, it's time to build the people's movement to say, we don't have to tolerate 42 million of our neighbors and 13 million American children going hungry. And I hope you'll all join with us to build the people's movement to finally end hunger in America and New York City.